Executive Director of the Glen Park Partnership for Arts and Culture, and I'm really delighted that everyone came today to enjoy this great lecture by Jim Sanborn. Jim Sanborn is here with the cooperation of the Marcia Matejka Gallery, which represents him, so I want to thank them for being involved and being a part of it, and of course thank Jim for making himself available for both the exhibition and for this talk. Now I'd like you to join me in welcoming artist Jim Sanborn.
This is for knuckles. Cell phones and sleepers, that kind of thing. We could probably turn the lights down. That would be great. I was very fortunate growing up in Washington and having a father who was the Library of Congress's chief exhibitionist. And I say that he was the director of exhibitions, Library of Congress for 30 years. And I followed in his footsteps in most respects. In that a lot of the artwork that I do, I more or less, I do sculpture, but I also put on exhibitions of my sculpture, and I also put on exhibitions of objects which a lot of people don't consider to be art, but as far as I'm concerned, that's fine and that's okay. After, I also had the run of the Library of Congress as a child and could run all through the stacks and learn as much as I wanted to learn, and also understand what exhibitions were about. One of my lasting images was seeing my dad handcuffed. But not everybody can see their father handcuffed in a good way. He was handcuffed to the Gutenberg Bible as it was being transferred from Washington, D.C. to the Metropolitan in New York for an exhibition. I also was able to handle, these days it doesn't happen, the Dead Sea Scrolls, in order to make a high school paper about them. That doesn't often happen either. So, you see, there were some advantages that I had. And then one of the great advantages was when I came to the park. And the thing about the park was, one of the major things that happened was that myself and Rhea Venorcha put together a program for obtaining surplus materials from the U.S. government and the GSA. And basically, it made me into a constructivist. It changed a lot of the artists that were here, because all of a sudden you had this gigantic cornucopia of every imaginable material. We could have brought spacecraft to the park if we wanted to work with the spacecraft. We didn't at the time. I would now, but we didn't at the time. So we had this huge amount of material, and with the foundry, we were melting down ships' propellers. We were sawing up large. I had tractor trailer loads of aluminum brought to the park and cut up into large public constructivist sculptures, which I dragged out to the green lawn at Geico with my truck, unloaded them on a Sunday afternoon, photographed them very quickly. The security guards come running out. I throw them back on the truck and take off. So that's how I started public art. And I did that more than once to more than several companies around the area. But that public art and myself have had an interesting involvement. It really started here because I had all of these free materials. And then public art has basically supported me since I left the park, and supported the kinds of installations that I do and the kind of work that I do, which is virtually unsaleable. I mean, a lot of it's very unsaleable. But the public art has helped get moved that along. So anyway, the slides that I'm showing you begin in around 1982. And following in that whole vein of working with museum pieces, this is one of the first shows that I did, and it's an Egyptian mummy that I borrowed from a museum in Richmond and then showed at the Virginia Museum. And so I remember carrying her around at 2 o'clock in the morning in the museum under my arm like a piece of wood. And at one point her hand fell off, her ear fell off, and I wired them back together and then put them on this platform more or less as a presentation. And the piece was called Invisible Forces in the Quest I think it was. And so in her case, it was a quest for everlasting life and the tree of life and all of these kinds of things. But it was one of my first installations. But again, it was mysterious in that what I did is I strung very thin monofilament all the way across this installation, which was in an alcove. And so it was a dark room, and it was lit in just the right way, so that when most museums don't present objects just right out there, right? In the Virginia Museum, you have to look through these windows and peer down in this tomb way down the bowels of the museum to see an Egyptian mummy. I wanted to present it right there. But I couldn't very well do that because it's such a valuable object, so I strung super thin monofilament so that when you walked up to it, you felt you were hit in the face with a spider web. Much like Howard Carter might have been hit in the face with a spider web as he opened King Tut's tomb. So that's sort of the idea behind the piece. It was there, but still untouchable and mysterious. Now, this is a mountaintop in southern Utah. And this black stone here, this guy right here, during storms for decades was hit by lightning repeatedly because it's iron ore and because it's called a lodestone. Lodestones are naturally magnetic stones. In the 1970s, I worked with constructivist materials from Glen. In the 1980s, I generally worked with lodestones and natural materials, stone and things like this, and made tableaus about magnetism and the Earth's magnetic force. So I collected these lodestones. I hooked this whole area was owned by a big iron mine in Utah, and it was just about getting ready they were going to lop the top off of this mountain. So just before that, I attached these stones to bulldozers and then dragged them down the mountain, put them on a truck, and brought them back to my studio and started working with lodestones for most of my pieces. This piece sort of tells a story of a lodestone, and this is a shelf of some red slate at the top. And there's a very thin crack in the red slate, and this whole piece is lit by one light source, a single light source. And so the crack, which I could adjust by sliding tiny pieces of stone in, could create this lightning bolt, which, if the slate is ground level, the lightning came through the ground, through the geological layers, and hit the lodestone in the ground and magnetized it and gave it special properties. As you probably know, lodestones were used by the Chinese in order for the Chinese geomancer to predict the future of an emperor. The Chinese would spin a spoon on a table that was made out of a lodestone, and only the geomancer or the shaman would know that the spoon would always point north and south, so he could rotate the board and trick the emperor and make the emperor believe anything he wanted, because he could spin the lodestone and make things work. And so lodestones have very magic powers, and so all through the 1980s, I did a lot of pieces using lodestones. This is a piece that I did in New York, and this is an array of compass dials the compass dials on this side of the room are all arrayed north and south of the Earth's magnetic field, and the compasses on this side are all arrayed in being controlled by lodestones. The only wrinkle in here was that there was an elevator behind this wall, and every time the elevator went past, all these compass dials rotated around, which is sort of interesting. It's very interactive relative to the building, which is kind of nice. But another interesting thing about lodestones, early African cultures, some of them in the Congo, and had these mountaintop retorts, and they put these large columns of lodestone on either side, and they were the first metal detectors. So somebody walked in with a spear, and the spear would get stuck to the lodestone, and they would know that that person was armed, and that would take the spear away. So it was a very interesting thing about lodestones. So I studied lodestones extensively for a fairly long period of time. And then again, this piece, which was actually at the Hirshhorn, I took a compass needle, a regular compass needle, and I polished the front of it, and I wrinkled it a little bit, and then put a very powerful light on it. So symbolically, this line means everything above here is above ground, and this is the horizon line, and everything below here is below ground. And so basically what I ended up with this powerful light is little lightning bolts here. And as the compasses moved in the eddies and currents of the air, these little lightning bolts would move all along the wall as shadow. And these were lodestones that were suspended by monofilaments, which became a nightmare at the museum because I had to go in every day and adjust the height because they kept stretching. Every night going back and forth, making these things that were all the same plane. But it was a fun piece. And again, this is an issue over the head, but it's a lightning bolt striking the lodestone because of its magic powers. Speaking of magic powers, now we have real science, we have pseudoscience, we have a lot of things. This is one of Virginia's finest dowsers. And this fellow is plying his trade. These are his dowsing rods. he has your basic fork stick in his pocket, and this is what he calls his dowsing cap, which he always takes with him so that he can more or less tell you where your water is or where it isn't. And so this whole pseudoscience started creeping into my true science, and I did a piece like this, which is called All Things Turned to Stone. And so these are basically dowsing rods. And inside, what I did is I drilled a very thin hole all the way through this stick, and I inserted a steel rod, a magnetic steel rod, inside each one of these. And so basically all these are suspended from one point and are moving very slightly back and forth in the air, but they all orient themselves north and south. So anytime this was shown in the museum, it had to be oriented in such a way that that was north and this was south. So this is a tree that was broken off in a violent storm, and all of these objects here had turned to stone. So basically, All Things That Turned to Stone was many different references, but since dowsers are looking for water, we have a fossilized seabed here that's about 200 million years old, and a piece of quartz that resembles ice, and so that was hence the title, All Things Turned to Stone. And then this is another piece. This was actually at the Phillips collection here in DC, and it was an installation, again, using fossils. Now, I borrowed these fossils from the National Museum of American History, installed them at the Phillips collection, and then they're installed in a very large bed of a fossilized seabed that I got in Utah, brought back and installed at the Phillips collection. And inside here, under here, there is a pool of water with a vortex generator in it. So I generated a vortex that was always moving, a whirlpool in here, and I had a light inside here that projected the moving whirlpool on the wall behind it. And so I always felt as if there was some connection, like at the bottom of the ocean you have these ammonites, which are curled in such a way, and perhaps a whirlpool came down and touched that ammonite, and then you go up to the surface of the ocean, and all of a sudden it turns into a water spout. And the water spout goes up into the sky, and above the sky you end up with spiral nebula. So there's this sort of continuum, went from spiral nebulas all the way down to ammonites, and that was the kind of thing I was trying to study, was that sort of overlapping, all of the sort of overlapping feelings about what natural things are and how they operate. I'm moving the screen by hitting this little red here, sorry about that. This is a piece along the same vein. This is in Silver Spring, Maryland, and this is a recreation. This is in front of a museum for NOAA, and it's a recreation of the Maine coastline. And so I rented boats, and I went to Maine, and I went on the coastline, and went out to sea, and photographed coastlines until I could find a coastline that I really wanted to use. Then I spent about a year of research and built a model of this commission, a working model that was about 16 feet long. And so a wave is propagated in this teacup of water. You can't have a pool of water any deeper than 32 inches, otherwise you have to have a lifeguard. Now that would look very stupid. So basically I did it without the lifeguard, 32 inches of water. I was able to make waves that were 12 feet high. So that was kind of remarkable in that they crash against here and splash all over the place. The piece is still operating. It's operating at about a third of what it's capable of operating at, because people are getting wet. So, that's pretty tedious. But you can sit here at lunch and close your eyes and really imagine that you're at the ocean, which was really the point of doing what I did. Then we get to this little object that nobody knows anything about. And so this is the piece Kryptos, my most infamous work, the Energizer Bunny of artworks. It never ceases to go away. I still get letters in the mail constantly from people who are fans or just basically insane. And so cryptography has a very special, to be a cryptography has a very special kind of mind. Sorry, Ed. Ed Scheid is here, a fellow who helped me and collaborated with me on the code for this. But it does seem to a great number of people who are interested in cryptography, I've learned over the 20 years since I've done this piece, are walking a very fine line between sanity, lucidity, and whatever it takes. The beautiful mind. There are people that look at this screen and can see all of these words magically appear and come out as if they're glowing in the dark. And that's not cryptography. That's not code breaking. This piece won't be cracked like that. But that doesn't dissuade these people from leaving their wives, leaving their jobs, sleeping in their cars, flying all over the world, sending me letters, sending me hate mail, you name it, it never ends, and it just continues on and on and on, and until you get to the nadir, like having popular fiction writers think about your work and this kind of business, and so, but this was Kryptos, and Kryptos was an interesting piece. It took me 2.5 years to do, and I learned a tremendous amount about the CIA, and maybe things I don't really want to know, but it's been very helpful. Let's just say the piece I did for CIA, I think, has helped me get through the later works, which were a little bit on the edge of legality. Okay, so you haven't seen those yet, but we're moving along. So when I was at CIA headquarters, I went down way behind where I was building my sculpture, and I was driving around, and I noticed a huge dumpster. In the ceiling above the dumpster, there was about a foot-wide tube that was continually raining down paper pulp. So in every office at the agency, people would, at the end of the day, they take their secret documents and they put them in a little bag, they put them down a chute in their office like the laundry chute. They would go into a hammer mill, which pounded it into paper pulp, but didn't get quite everything. So basically I saw this ore, you know, this infinite amount of ore sitting down there, and so I said, aha. So basically, insanely, the next day I came with my car. I said, if I'm going to do it, I got to see if I can make art out of it. So I just drove down there, had 5-gallon pails in the back of my car, jumped out of my car, went over there, filled the pails up, threw them in the back of my car, raced out through the gates, fully expecting those things to pop up right at the main entrance, and they never did, and I escaped. I felt great. So I went back to the studio, I started making things out of the paper pulp, and it actually was a really wonderful material to work with. There's one in the gallery now. It is very long lasting. It doesn't seem to fade. They use high quality paper. But there are other things in here, which was interesting. There are plastic images of jets on the runway. There are images of Iraq. These pieces were garnered from the agency in 1991, right around the beginning of the Gulf War. And so a lot of the work I did early on using this paper pulp was related to the Gulf War. This, though, is not, and it is related to something entirely different. This is the first piece I made, and it was after I successfully built this piece, which is also in the gallery, the very first piece. This is paper pulp, but on the outside it was lined with chicken wire, and then I just packed the pulp in there, and then I pressed letters on the inside, so you have to peer through this crack to read a secret code that's on the inside. This piece is called Comigmolo. A comigmolo is that chimney on the top of the Vatican through which all those votes pass after they've been burned up. The little puff of smoke comes out, and they voted on a pope. That's the comigmolo. So I figured there are all these secrets inside such a thing. Not that I'm a religious person, but I just thought the choice of objects was nice. And so this was the first piece. I said, aha, let's make a deal. William Webster, who was then the director of CIA. And I'll tell you what, Bill, I will give you the secret to Kryptos if you give me access to this paper pulp. Now, in typical CIA fashion, I'm not that stupid, so basically, maybe I gave it to Bill, maybe I didn't give it to Bill. But I got the paper pulp, that's all that really mattered. So I got 8,000 pounds of wet paper. What do you do with it? You got to dry it out, otherwise it gets really moldy fast. So I rented a warehouse, an 8,000 square foot warehouse, and basically covered the entire ground with paper pulp and raked it every day for 4 months until it dried out. Then I put it in bags, took it to my studio in Northeast Washington, and stored it there for 20 years and never used it. I used it some to build these pieces like the one you just saw, and then this installation. This installation basically is what I call is sort of a creation of a code room. In the basements of most U.S. embassies around the world, and most foreign embassies where we live now in D.C., there are rooms in the bowels of the places they are. So, and the outsides of the rooms are covered with copper screen to remove RF radiation, which might escape from the room or might enter the room. In addition to that, it cancels out microwave radiation and things like this. So these pieces are covered with copper. There are coded sections on the inside. One side's in Russian, one side's in Arabic. They discuss covert operations carried out against the Soviet Union. and covert operations carried out in Iraq. And they're sitting on a nice red hot base made out of red sandstone, or sort of, harking back to the incendiary nature of the material. So in addition to that, I did a whole series of coded works. So all through the 1990s, I did works based on codes and various things. This was what I called it's a media filter. Okay, so somewhere in your brain, there is this little filter in there that can filter out things like deceit. It filters out, bad things you don't want to think about. It filters out all sorts of stuff. But those filters get worn out, right? You get a hole in it, right? And so this particular filter might be the Russian word for shadow or secret or deceit or deception or any of those things. So these words are basically, so this is the deceit filter that's been used and thrown out. Just like the pleated filter in your furnace. That's all this is. This is the one you can get and it filtered out. This is a piece that I did. This is a piece of stainless steel, and it's etched all the way through with letters. And it's in French, and the whole smoke and mirrors thing, right? So this is basically a mirror casting shadows and reflections. Down here it's the opposite of what it is up here. And so this is ombre, which is shadow, etc. And this is a piece that I did, a small piece. And when I concluded doing those, I started making bigger ones. So basically, when I did the CIA piece, I had some of the pieces sitting in my studio. I started rearranging them and figured, let's see, the old magic lantern trick. And so basically, I decided to do a series of pieces based on coding systems. So one half of the cylinder is a code. The other half is a chart for deciphering it, much like the piece at CIA. This is like I did in 1992. There's only one English word, Medusa. I thought it was interesting, Medusa and then USA. So anyway, Medusa was the only word in there, and basically you're supposed to decipher this piece. This piece has become public art, and now it's at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, between the art department and the, I think it's the broadcasting department. Again, another piece which has helped me get by. So this is a piece I did a couple of years ago. It's ironic because what this building is, this is the building at Louisiana State University, Department of Energy, Coast, and Environment. Now you guys remember the oil spill, right? That small oil spill. Well, all the great heads and all the minds are in this building trying to discern how they're going to fix and plug that oil leak in the Gulf of Mexico. And so this is in front of their building. So what the text is that I chose, and I choose different texts, and the texts that I use are all in the languages of their time, which means if somebody spoke something and wrote it down in Greek, then I present it in Greek. So these cylinders on either side of this building and project on the building are projecting texts from eyewitnesses to the largest natural oil spills on record, produced only by nature, not by man. So basically, all these are naturally produced oil spills from ships sailing through the Santa Barbara Channel, and as far as you could see, the sea was on fire, and there were volcanoes coming out of Santa Barbara, volcanoes of oil pouring into the Santa Barbara Channel. Of course, all that's been cleaned up, but, Gulf of Mexico seems to be still a problem. But I thought that kind of treatment for this kind of public project was important. This piece is for the University of Houston. It's a new library called the M.D. Anderson Library. And basically, what do students have on their mind most of the time? Relationships, right? Girlfriends, all this kind of business. So what I did for text on these, in all the different languages, from Ovid to Milan Kundera to a whole variety of people. This piece was called A, A. So every sentence and every series of sentences in here is a series of commas. So they're very short little pieces about relationships in about 15 different languages. And so this piece is actually sitting on a large black stone line, as if it's a comma. So if you look at it from up here, this is where all the hoity-toity graduate students can look over the edge down at this, and it looks like a comma on a line of text. This is a piece that I did after that, another public piece. This is at MIT in Boston. And basically what this is a projection. There's a white marble disc inlaid into the floor, the paving of the entrance to the microbiology department. So I made a macro/microbiological installation. So this is a white marble disc, but there's a very powerful projector in the ceiling called a Pani projector. It's made in Austria, $60,000 unit, right? As part of the commission, I got the unit. I convinced the scientists to give me a series of slides and to continue changing the slides depending on what they're working on at any given time upstairs. So basically, these are all images from electron microscopes and microscopic images of what they were working on at a given time. That's the micro part. The macro part was a standard wall made out of blocks of limestone. That's the original wall. So I had that wall transformed into split layers like fossil layers of limestone under the earth. Then they have a line of petrified seabed as a fossil, and then the wall continues. And then the 80-foot long wall, the wall slowly transforms back into cut limestone blocks like you'd see in any archaeological or any geological formation. Made out of blocks of limestone. That's the original wall. So I had that wall transformed into split layers like fossil layers of limestone under the earth. Then they have a line of petrified seabed as a fossil, and then the wall continues. And then the 80-foot long wall, the wall slowly transforms back into cut limestone blocks like you'd see in any archaeological or any geological formation. So micro, macro. So that work at CIA, and for the 10 years after CIA, that was heavy stuff. I mean, I was working with institutionalized secrecy, subject to espionage, passing secrets, deceit, all sorts of things like this. I needed a break. So basically, remember that projector at MIT? So that projector at MIT was a pricey object. So basically what I did is I copied every millimeter of it and made drawings of it. And I bought the lenses, only the glass lenses from Austria. So I bought the lenses from Austria, but built the whole unit myself, and then powered it by a generator, and put it in the back of a Jeep, and went out west with a whole series of slides. Each slide was about 12 by 12 inches. And basically went into the desert with this projection system, an assistant, and a 4x5 camera, and set these things up often. Like this is shiprock. We set up the projector about a half a mile away from shiprock and projected the grid, physically projected the grid onto shiprock, and this is exactly what it looked like at 2 o'clock in the morning on a moonlit night. And so then I photographed that tableau in front of me. This was a way for me, there were a whole lot of artists who were using bulldozers and earth movers and making public art, making private art actually, with the environment. I tried to make as large a possible a statement as I could without leaving any kind of trace on the landscape. And this was the easiest way for me to do it. It was two of us, a projector and a camera, and we'd zip in and we'd do this during the night. If it wasn't right, we'd drive from Utah to Denver to process the film, and then back shoot it the next night. If it wasn't right, we'd go back and forth for this 8-hour drive each direction until we got it right. A very grueling thing, something I wouldn't do at this age. This is the same kind of idea. Today, these hills are very pristine when I shot these pieces in probably 1995 was the first time I went out there. Now, these hills are completely covered with all-terrain vehicle tracks and motorcycle tracks and everything, and they're more or less wasted. All this is sort of a wasteland now more than it was. Of course, in that 18th, 19th century, people thought it was a wasteland anyway. But one of the main reasons I went out west to do the grid pieces, the one you saw before, was I was emulating the 19th century cartographers who were sent out west by the U.S. government to document landscapes. So if I projected a grid on landscape, basically, that grid was linked by GPS to its particular location. So the title of the work was the GPS coordinates of that particular piece. This is another piece. I projected the concentric circles on a hole in the rock. This is called Hole in the Rock. And it's on the Indian reservation in Arizona. And basically, this is again at 2 o'clock in the morning with a lot of moonlight lighting the landscape. And those are star trails that go by in 15-minute exposures. This is the piece that I did in Oregon, off the coast of Oregon. It's called Bandon, Oregon. This is a circle that I projected, again, at 2 o'clock in the morning, but with like a 20-minute exposure. You can tell how long the exposure is on how long the star trails are. And this ring that I projected is 2 miles across. So that is 2 miles from here. And so it's a very large ring. It was projected in fog. And I went to the coast of Oregon in particular to work with fog. And I made several images using foggy environments. But this is the one that seems to have stuck. Now, this is the last projection. This is the last projection trip that I took. After this, I started something entirely new. The last projection trip took us to White Sands, New Mexico. White Sands, New Mexico is a very beautiful place. It's covered with gypsum crystal sand. It's bright white. When you're out in the middle of White Sands, New Mexico, you think you're at the Arctic. It's just an amazing place, and I thought it would be a great place for projections. But what I found was this little tiny store in the National Monument had this little booklet that says, well, guess what? 20 miles north of here was the place where the first atomic test took place. And in the book, it showed some very simple little tests, some very simple little experiments that they had done in order to determine the yield of an atomic blast. And I became fascinated with the first atomic blast. So basically, you can imagine July 16, 1945, 5:30 in the morning, you're lying in bed, right? At that point, apparently in New Mexico at that time of year, it was dark. All of a sudden, the sky lights up, it's bright, and whoa, it's sunrise. Look over at the clock, no, it's only 5:30. The irony is that this is a radioactive clock sitting on your nightstand glowing with radium. So the radioactive clock told you that an atomic bomb just exploded, basically. So I thought that ironic. So I went around with a Geiger counter down there and collected radioactive clocks and started epoxy a clock in one end of a black box, epoxy a 4x5 camera in the other end, open the shutter, leave it for a month, and it makes this kind of image because the clocks no longer glow in the dark. So basically, I started collecting clocks. This is the time when the blast occurred, when the first atomic blast happened. This is another clock. Obviously, these are very faint. It took 2 months to take a picture of this one because these were so faint. And I did it over and over again until I got the clocks. This all started a project I did called Atomic Time. So I went into Los Alamos, New Mexico. And I went around to retirement homes. I put up little signs. And then I went around to coffee shops and I put up little signs. The little sign says, do you have anything left over from the Manhattan Project in your basement? If you do have anything left over from the Manhattan Project, and you would like to have it shown in a major museum, please let me know. Obviously, the Smithsonian at the time was not interested in radioactive things or anything to do with the atomic bomb. They had exiled the Enola Gay out into Virginia somewhere. And so basically, they had no home and none of these pieces went anywhere. So basically, these objects here were very pivotal to the first atomic bomb. These are called pusher spheres. I found these at bird baths in 2 different people's backyards. The other places was somebody called me up and says, listen, meet me over at my house. And the guy, these are all octogenarians, people who work in the Manhattan Project. Los Alamos on weekends, Saturdays, was scrap metal day. And just like Ray and I would go down to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Los Alamos opened their gates in the 1950s, and they put price tags of $5, $2, $3 on these historic objects that these scientists who had stayed around Los Alamos their whole lives decided to collect and keep because they knew they were important. They knew they were part of the first atomic bomb, but basically nobody really was interested in the atomic bomb history, so they kept them. And so they started coming out of the woodwork, and I bought up as many as I could in the town with the promise I had to buy them. I couldn't just take them and nothing, and I couldn't just borrow them because it got complicated when you're an artist trying to do an installation in a museum. So I started gathering equipment. This table actually came from the Naval Shipyard in Norfolk, but nobody but Ray and I know that. And so, but the other objects all came from Los Alamos. And so I built this into an installation, which is a recreation of the laboratory that built the first atomic bomb. Okay? So one of the interesting things about this laboratory, and all this equipment was collected from Los Alamos. I basically didn't make any of it except these tables that these experiments are sitting on. I fabricated the tables, and I worked with images from that I got from Los Alamos, which were very few and far between, incidentally, at the time before, like 9/11. And so I was able to recreate the atomic bomb in the internal physics package of the atomic bomb, and the most accurate ever done. And so one of the interesting things about the laboratory, you might notice these little stools here. Well, these little stools are very particular. They're made in a very short, for a very short time. But the scientists liked it because what does that look like, sort of? An atomic explosion with a ring cloud, right? These guys loved these stools. They've had these around. It was a joke. They called a lot of their objects, they had pet names, most of them to do with Walt Disney movies at the time. So they had, all Felix the cat was a Geiger counter, for example, and things like this. So basically, the installation is an accurate representation of what the laboratory looked like, and this was my interpretation of Munch's screen. Okay, so I arrange the wires, I present the materials, I make the tables, I make all of these objects. I took those pusher spheres, those ugly metal spheres you saw as bird baths, and machined into this. It was part of the original atomic bomb form, and I machined it into this. So in the actual bomb, and this is all absolutely to scale and as perfect as it's ever been, is inside here there's half a ball of plutonium. The other half is over here. So this is plutonium, and then it's surrounded by a cylinder of uranium-238. And inside that there's a little initiator made out of polonium and radium. And so this whole thing gets reassembled. So this piece goes on here, and then this goes on there, and then the top part of it, that cylinder slides inside here, and then these two spheres go on top of each other and make a solid ball of metal. That solid ball of metal is then surrounded by 18 inches of high explosive material, and in an atomic blast, the first atomic blast in Alamogordo, New Mexico, called Fat Man, that particular device was hauled to the top of the tower. They detonated the 18 inches of explosives that was lensed to push to the inside. It crushed this 18-inch sphere into a ball about 6 inches in diameter, physically crushed the metal. That caused that little tiny initiator in the middle to give off a burst of neutrons. Those neutrons fissioned the uranium-238. That's what caused the explosion, and the huge explosion occurred. That's the way an atomic bomb works. And this, according to the scientists that came to visit my exhibition, this is probably a 9 on a scale of 1 to 10 in accuracy of what it looked like. These are called criticality experiments. These tables are about this high, right? They're about like this, okay? So basically, in these experiments, the radioactive material, which would be this ball of plutonium, at night, or when they're not working in the lab, there's a hydraulic cylinder, like the one in your local garage, that lowered this ball of plutonium way down into the ground so it wasn't dangerous anymore. Well, you wake up first thing in the morning, you're a scientist in Los Alamos, you go to the lab, you hit the cylinder, and the cylinder pushes the uranium up the plutonium. How do you protect yourself? So these are blocks of graphite, right? Graphite is a real good moderator of neutrons, and so this is fairly toxic, but I thought it was interesting that all these people doing these experiments were men. And so the top of the table was about here, and they put all the clocks here, okay? So think about it. And so, yeah, so that was sort of an interesting thing. And this is the interior of it, and that's the plutonium. So in a plutonium weapon, the amount of plutonium you need is about the size of a large orange. The amount of uranium-238 that you need to make a bomb is about the size of a small soccer ball. So the way two bombs are made is out of those two different materials. So basically, I took this installation to Gwangju Biennale in South Korea, right? And I took the president of South Korea through it. And we were followed by all these photographers. There was one particular Chinese photographer there who said he was taking really detailed pictures so that he could put it on the internet, right? And so I have to say, within 2 years, North Korea detonated the exact same device in North Korea. Now, who knows, the information's out there, but that's the way it is. So, this is another criticality experiment, except it uses boron impregnated polyethylene. And this sphere here and this sphere here are about 7 inches in diameter. These were brought out of a garage, being held one in each hand, as if they were like the Holy Grail. okay? And they were brought to me, and so this was what the bomb went from 18 inches in diameter. By 1955, it would come down to this size. So this is this is the aluminum prototype that they would then machine out of beryllium to make the casing for the bomb itself. So basically, these were given to me, and then I built them into this installation. This is the interior. This is called a levitated sphere. This would be a small ball of plutonium in the center. And it will be levitated by little things that come out and support it. And so this ball goes together, it's surrounded by high explosives, and all of a sudden you have a suitcase-sized bomb. You no longer have to carry around a 10,000-pound bomb. So this is all very sort of scary stuff. These at the end of the night were put into these cylinders, which I collected from somebody else. This is another installation on how you determine the neutron flux of a particular amount of uranium. So this is all the original equipment that was used to determine those kinds of questions. Mary Curie, you probably remember that name. She was the person who, in a giant metal cauldron, started refining uranium in her laboratory in Poland, and made what was called the first autoradiograph. And she basically, on black and white film, stuck a piece of uranium on black and white film and made an image. Well, basically, this is my attempt at the same kind of thing, except it's in color. So basically what I did is I gathered together about 20 different chunks of uranium. Jay and I would travel around the U.S. to uranium mines with a Geiger counter, and we'd snatch these blocks, and I really appreciate the Bureau of Land Management's lax. They're not very watchful of uranium mines, right? So you can just walk in there and grab stuff. So anyway, Jay and I grabbed pieces of uranium, brought it back to the studio, placed it on ready load packs, plastic ready load packs for 4x5 film, left it on there for a month and a half, and that's the image that came out. There's been no color manipulation or anything. That's exactly the color that comes out. And incidentally, this particular blue color is the color of radioactivity. If there is a radioactive accident, for example, as there were at Los Alamos, what happens when you bring two highly volatile pieces of uranium together into a critical mass, when it goes critical, it gives off a huge blue glow in the room. If that blue glow falls on you, you're dead. And I remember when I was 12 years old, my father took me to the Naval Research Lab down along the Potomac River, and they had one of the earlier nuclear reactors, okay? And so I remember as a 12-year-old climbing up on top of the reactor. I climbed up these little metal steps and got up on the top, and I stood up on the top of it, and I looked down between my legs, and there's this giant blue glow all down there below me, right? And so that impressed the hell out of me. So basically, that's one of the reasons that I endeavored to do what I did, and I survived this one. This is another piece of uranium placed on, this is probably the most perfect portrait of a piece of stone, a piece of uranium that was placed just on film. It almost looks like the piece of rock that it's, an image of. But again, it's the radioactivity making the image, nothing else. No light involved. A small farmhouse just outside of Minneapolis. A place called Waukesha. Walked into this farmhouse with my Geiger counter. This guy had something I wanted. We walked into the front door, and the whole downstairs was filled with Winnie the Pooh objects. This person collected for 30 years. So the whole downstairs was filled with Winnie the Pooh. And so we walked upstairs, and the whole upstairs was filled with uranium-tipped weapons. Over the bed, nice cases, coal drawers, hundreds of these things, all highly radioactive, surrounding his bedroom. And in the daughter's room. And he collected these things for 30 years. These projectiles are called depleted uranium projectiles. They're used by military services around the world, basically to penetrate tanks. Uranium has the wonderful ability, if you want to call it wonderful, to burn. It's pyrophoric, and it's extremely heavy. So you have a very heavy fire-producing object being fired at a tank. So they use these a lot. So I basically, this is right before 9/11, we mailed these back and forth to each other through the U.S. mail. And I made a special crate out of styrofoam and lined with lead, and then we put these in there. He mailed me one, I photographed it, they'd take a piece of 4x5 film and lay it on the bullet, right? I'd lay it on the bullet. It would take about 2 weeks to make this image. Again, it hasn't been altered in any way. This is transparency film. And so basically, this is a radiograph taken from the bullet. This is another one. This is called a pencil dart. And it's another same kind of penetrator. It's a tank penetrator. And again, we mail these back and forth until basically 9/11. I mean, it probably just stopped. Okay, so the Carnegie Institution here in Washington, D.C. It's a nice leafy neighborhood. And the scientists at the Carnegie Institution wanted to start splitting atoms. But they didn't think it would be a real popular idea with the neighbors. So they had to build a big facility. So they built this giant facility and they decided to call the Atomic Physics Observatory. Observatories are benign things. You can open them up and look at the stars, so it didn't make a wrinkle in the neighborhood. So they built this building, and they built this particle accelerator in that building. And this accelerator basically generates about 3 million volts here with this sphere, channels that voltage down this tube into a basement room located underneath, and there are these little tiny wires. Actually, these are real silk threads that were used by the scientists, and they control this, and they control the ion gun and all this stuff using silk. And this was the first major electrostatic particle accelerator. This is the idea, okay? So you have this, all that stuff up here, the belt, the accelerator beam comes down here, goes through the floor, through a magnet, down here where the scientist is just hanging around with no radioactive protection at all. And the beam comes down here, goes into a cloud chamber right here, where he has a camera and he's taking a picture of the activity in the cloud chamber. And this was a picture that was put out by Westinghouse in order to sell one of these large particle accelerators. This is the same unit that is used in oncology departments to treat cancer as well. So I walk into remember that underneath that particle accelerator, it went through the floor into a room underneath. And I went into that room about 7 years ago. I went into that room. I don't go into any rooms like this without a Geiger counter. And so I went into the room with a Geiger counter, and my Geiger counter starts going crazy, right? Now this is a fairly large concrete room, and it's filled with 2x4s and lawnmowers, and groundskeeping equipment's piled all over the place. There's a little wooden cabinet on the wall, right? And the closer I got to it, the more my Geiger counter started going off, right? And so I open up the doors, and the Geiger counter goes crazy, right? And so I'm looking at all the uranium, fluoride, all these things are in addition to being radioactive, they're highly explosive. So anyway, so all these little objects here, if you read this carefully, this is polonium-210. Remember polonium-210? That has a significant effect on human beings when they eat it. So basically, this is highly toxic stuff. This apparently was removed fairly quickly after we made this discovery, and then I continued on with my project. I didn't use any of this, but this is actually historic chemicals, right? And I was just actually at the physics, I was taken on a tour of the physics department at the Smithsonian Institution, and they have hundreds of bottles just like these of historic chemicals that were used for historic experiments, all in cabinets with radioactive symbols on them and everything. And who knows, that could be where those things are now, but I just thought it was interesting that they were just sort of like hanging out there like they were in 1935. So you can see the dates on these. So these are the drawings that I got from the library at the Carnegie, and took these photographs with my little camera when I was in the library. And from these photographs and those drawings, I wanted to recreate that experiment, fissioning uranium, and I wanted to recreate the machine. That first machine that you saw was ignominiously sawed up by the Smithsonian and now is in storage out someplace in Maryland and probably never to be seen again. So in order for me to use this as part of my thing, I had to rebuild it. So basically, using these photographs, I started working. And so these are the internal tubes of a particle accelerator. These are called potential rings. This is a Pyrex glass cylinder. This is the base of a 5 million volt Van de Graaff generator that was fabricated. This is a sphere I fabricated in my studio down where we live now is on an island in Chesapeake Bay. Basically, I needed a place with a moat. And because I didn't want people with pitchforks coming to my gate. So basically I fabricated all of this and built it the Carnegie went through several iterations of the machine. First they built this machine outside, which is the one that I emulated. And then they realized it's kind of tough to split atoms outdoors. And besides that, the neighbors can get bummed out if they find out. So we have to put a building around it. So they put a building around it. And so basically my machine configuration is roughly like this. Assembled on the island, it's 28 feet high. It generates 5 million volts. These are lightning strikes that come down the column. This is a steady stream. This is the discharges that come down the equipotential rings. The fission occurs down here. There's a small Hasselblad camera here to record events, and this is all in the beautiful outdoors. I really liked the idea of nuclear physics in nature. It all just seems so appropriate somehow. So basically that was on the island. This thing makes, every time these lightning bolts hit, it sounds like a 357 Magnum being shot off. So basically, I discovered the same thing they discovered, impossible to fission outside. So I basically went inside and emulated this machine, which they built later, which is a smaller version of the big machine and works much better because it's inside. So my machine version is this one. So this is a studio shot in my studio. This is the accelerator tube for the big machine. And I basically took one of these sections and put it on here, made a smaller Van de Graaff generator here, which only generates about 1.5 million volts up here. So the 1.5 million volts is generated here. It gives you an electron or proton beam, comes down through here, and then hits this little target right here. There's a little target. And then the target will ultimately be made out of beryllium, so that the protons hit the beryllium, make neutrons, they go into the cloud chamber where there's a piece of uranium, and you have fission, and you try to record it on video. So this is actually a small machine in operation. You can see similarities. There are lightning bolts coming down here, lightning across here. The fission is occurring inside this chamber right here. There are slide projectors in order to make it so I can take pictures. This is the interior parts. I had to build all of this with help from several physicists who were probably really annoyed with me after the phone calls 24 hours a day trying to figure out how to do this. My telephone was tricky, but we pulled it off and we succeeded, but it took a very long time. It took a couple of years just to get the machine to function. This is the target. This is the first time I burned a hole in it, and I figured I got a beam and I burned a hole in it, so that was a good thing. This is the cloud chamber that I made. This is now, the target's been replaced by a piece of beryllium right there. And so now the beam comes down, hits the beryllium, gives off neutrons, which hits the cloud chamber. This is the interior picture of a cloud chamber taken by the Carnegie Institution during fission events. So basically, they're showing you where electrons are, where a fast neutron came through, and a cloud chamber image by them. And my cloud chamber image is similar, but we did it on video. It could get a little loud, but you get the same idea. The snapping sound that you hear are arcs that are created by the high voltage that's generated, and but you can see small tracks being given off by the uranium piece that's located, and then you can see large tracks like this one coming up toward the uranium at the top. So that big particle accelerator made its way to Denver. So in order to I disassembled it, put it on a vehicle, shrink wrapped everything, took it to Denver and installed it at the Museum of Contemporary Art in 2010. Installed it there, it barely fit on the truck, took 2 tractor trailers to get it there. And it was installed like this. I like the idea of installing big science as a fallen icon. So basically, this is my accelerator on its side, like, you know, like Ozymandias. We all remember Ozymandias in Egypt. Ozymandias was a giant statue that fell over and is eulogized in so many poems. And basically, I like the idea of having it on its side. This is a neutron detector that I use. This is part of the original accelerator from the Carnegie that they were kind enough to give me. Carnegie stools and all of this stuff basically recreated that event. The next slide. Now, when I was in my studio doing the fission, right, so this is the machine. 30 feet away from me was the machine. And these are the small strings right here. The small strings are attached to these knobs right here. Mr. Sanborn is sitting here on top of this little platform. On the front of this thing, there's about 1 inch of lead. In front of that, there's 2 feet of water. Right? So the lead in the water, and this is lead glass. So I can look through the lead glass and see the fission down here at the end with a pair of binoculars. So I knew I had fission by that and also by the sound that the Geiger counter made. So if I had, this is one Geiger counter, but I also had a Geiger counter on the inside. So the Geiger counter on the inside was going click, 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 which is not too bad. But then if I lifted it up and put it outside, it would click, 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 click. So outside my little booth, things were nasty. So basically that's what fission is, and it creates high radioactivity. So this is the finished tube. This is also part of an ion gun assembly from the Carnegie that I use. And that's more or less in operational mode. This is the one again, just in the gallery, this is the way it's displayed with a Hasselblad camera here to record the events inside the cloud chamber, or a video camera, which is what I use to show you what I just showed you. Then this is just another view showing these are water tanks, again for neutrons. This is a fish tank with water in it that I look through, in addition to lead glass to protect me from radiation. And then, let's see, this is the video of the projection of the fission events. And this is the last thing. This is a piece of dry ice. I used dry ice in my installation under my cloud chamber. While I was working with it, I discovered the most interesting properties. This piece looks like a piece of a glacier. It looks like a piece of ice. It's kind of like ice 9 in a Bonnet map, right? It's like, it's nasty, it's toxic, it gives off carbon dioxide, it's anti-ice. So I thought the irony was that something can be very beautiful, but at the same time be very toxic. What you hear in the background is melting glaciers in the Arctic. So the piece basically is a videotape of this image, and what you hear in the background is it's been caused by the carbon dioxide and potentially the global warming events. And this is the last image. There's a little pool of water next to it, but it's currently melting. I mean, currently freezing. You can see it's slowly frozen this piece of water as it comes out here. Okay, so basically, that's the end of the images. These days, what I'm working on is I've done an about face. I've gone back to my own early history. I'm currently working with the looting of antiquities, and I've gone to Cambodia and I've purchased a whole bunch of high-end reproductions, which I am now in the process of aging and forging into objects that would be fit for a Sotheby's catalog, and am doing installations about that whole looting and forging of antiquities. So that's more or less where I'm going now for this next decade. Any questions?